A low hum. Then, the sickening crunch of kinetic impact against the starboard shields. Engineer Lyra gripped the edges of her console. Her bioluminescent chromatophores flashed a distressed, rapid-fire violet beneath her collar. Captain Kalen was wrestling the luminous path through another violent evasive arc, but the three Skarn warships were already closing the distance. They moved like scavengers, precise and hungry, maintaining a synchronized attack formation that was slowly stripping the Azurian vessel of its defenses. Next to Lyra's primary diagnostic screen, a chipped ceramic mug vibrated violently against the metal dash. It contained a dark, bitter Terran liquid called coffee. It was a parting gift from a previous, highly confusing trade exchange. Right now, the dark liquid was sloshing precariously, threatening to spill over the only functioning thermal dampener she had left on the portside grid. "Shields at 14%, Lyra reported. She forced her vocal cords to remain steady, swallowing the dry terror in her throat. "They are targeting our main drive." Through the reinforced viewport, the trailing Skarn raider broke formation slightly. Its portside thruster was running cold, venting a thin, persistent trail of pale blue exhaust. A minor engine malfunction. It didn't matter. The other two were already locking targeting lasers onto the Azurian merchant vessel. Kalen had already broadcast the wide-spectrum distress signal across all civilized frequencies. What happened in the next 10 minutes is something the Azurian High Council tried to classify. You will want to remember this sequence of events. Stay close. The automated responses chimed into the bridge with agonizing cheerfulness, a sharp contrast to the groaning hull. The Aegis cited strict, bureaucratic jurisdictional limits, their polished automated voice apologizing for the inconvenience of impending destruction. The Prime Hegemony offered a pre-recorded message detailing their scheduled hibernation cycles, suggesting a callback in 3 standard planetary rotations. Bureaucracy and apathy. The galaxy's most civilized empires had sent paperwork to a battlefield. Another kinetic slug hammered the aft shields. The physical shockwave threw Lyra against her harness. The lights on the bridge flickered, plunging them into momentary darkness before the harsh red emergency strips flared to life, casting long shadows across the deck plating. "Navigator Joran, status on the slipspace drive?" Kalen demanded. His hands flew across the tactile helm controls, trying to squeeze a few more degrees of rotation out of the straining thrusters. "Offline," Joran gasped. His forehands struggled to stabilize the erratic flight path, his normally pale skin flushed dark with exertion. "The magnetic coils are completely fused. We have no jump capability." They were dead in the water. Lyra watched the telemetry data as the Skarn warships fanned out for the final, synchronized killing blow. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable shriek of the hull breach alarms. Instead, the communications console screamed. It wasn't a standard hailing frequency. It was a brutal, unencrypted audio transmission that bypassed their security protocols purely through raw, overwhelming signal strength. A localized thermal dampener on Lyra's console immediately shorted out, throwing sparks onto the deck plating. The sensors were misreading the approaching energy signature as a localized stellar anomaly. "Azurian vessel," a voice crackled over the bridge speakers. It sounded like gravel being crushed under a heavy mechanical tread. "This is the Iron Nomad, confirming a 20-minute intercept course. Hold your breath." Joran stared at his sensor readouts, his secondary eyes blinking in rapid confusion. "Captain, the origin code. It's an unregistered signature. Terran, I think. Unless. No. That kind of kinetic acceleration would liquefy an Azurian spine." Lyra watched the incoming telemetry data warp and glitch. The approaching vessel wasn't decelerating. It was burning fuel at a rate that defied standard safety regulations, maintaining maximum velocity straight into a combat zone. Space tore open. The Iron Nomad didn't glide gracefully out of slipspace like a civilized vessel. It violently ripped its way back into real space, bleeding off dangerous levels of Cherenkov radiation that blinded the local sensor nets for 3 full seconds. The massive ship dropped directly between the luminous path and the Skarn raiders, inserting itself as a physical shield. Lyra had expected a sleek military cruiser, something polished and formidable. What hovered on her tactical screen was a brutalist wedge of dark, unpainted metal. It was covered in jagged welding seams, mismatched plating, and deep, carbon-scored scars from countless undocumented impacts. It looked less like a spaceship and more like a blunt instrument designed for trauma. It was entirely functional, aggressively devoid of aesthetic design. It was a machine built by a species that viewed survival as a daily physical confrontation. The Skarn Vanguard fired immediately. 3 concentrated plasma bolts slammed directly into the Terran ship's broadside, a coordinated strike that would have vaporized the luminous path. The Azurian crew braced for the explosion, but the Iron Nomad simply absorbed the impact. Its hull didn't rely on elegant energy displacement fields or delicate refraction arrays. It relied on sheer, absurd material density. The thermal bloom dissipated, leaving the dark metal glowing a dull, angry red. The transmission crackled open again. "Cute," the gravelly voice said. "Our turn." The Iron Nomad didn't maneuver. It lunged. It fired a barrage of overloaded industrial mining lasers, blindingly bright, directly into the Skarn formation. These beams weren't designed for precise military combat. They were designed to crack open planetary crusts. They sliced through the void with terrifying, unfocused thermal output. The sheer aggression of the maneuver shattered the Skarn formation. The raiders broke their attack run, scattering wildly to avoid the uncoordinated ferocity of the counterattack. Lyra watched in stunned silence as the Skarn warships diverted all power to their engines. They began to fall back, their thrusters flaring bright against the dark as they scrambled to put distance between themselves and the scarred Terran behemoth. The bridge of the luminous path exhaled. It was a collective, shuddering release of atmospheric pressure from 50 lungs. Lyra's hands uncurled from the edges of her console, her chromatophores shifting from panicked violet to a deeply exhausted, muted blue. On her primary diagnostic screen, the threat indicators blinked out one by one as the Skarn warships shrank into distant, fleeing specks on the tactical radar. The chipped ceramic mug on her dash finally stopped its relentless vibration, the dark liquid inside settling into a perfectly still, glassy reflection of the emergency lights. They had survived. Captain Kalen slumped into his command harness, his secondary eyelids sliding shut as he keyed the comms array to formally thank their brutal saviors. The tension completely drained from the room. Then the radar shrieked. It was a high-pitched, sustained electronic scream that rattled Lyra's teeth. The trailing Skarn raider, the one Lyra had explicitly noted earlier, venting a thin trail of pale blue exhaust from a failing thruster, had not been leaking. It had been systematically laying a dense, volatile plasma minefield in its wake. The pursuing Iron Nomad flew directly into the invisible ignition zone. The resulting detonation blinded the local quadrant. A massive wave of concentrated thermal energy violently threw the Terran dreadnought sideways, stripping away chunks of its ablative armor. The false retreat was over. The Skarn executed a flawless pivot in the void, turning their combined heavy cannons onto the exposed underbelly of the Terran ship. They didn't hesitate. A lethal barrage struck the Iron Nomad, enveloping the brutalist wedge in a localized firestorm. Lyra watched, her hands trembling over her dead console, expecting the unregistered vessel to finally break apart under the overwhelming focused fire. No ship built by the Aegis or the Prime Hegemony could withstand that level of sustained thermal degradation. But Captain Vance did not retreat. He initiated a high-G evasive roll. It was a maneuver so physically punishing, so violently abrupt, it defied standard flight mechanics. The sheer centrifugal force would have liquefied an Azurian spine. The massive, scarred vessel violently corrected its trajectory, shedding burning armor plates as it slammed its heavily reinforced prow directly into the lead Skarn raider's flank. The kinetic shockwave shattered the raider's navigational arrays. Then, the raider's outer hull began to blister and melt from the outside. 3 figures clad in heavy, bulky powered armor launched themselves across the silent, deadly gap of space. They attached themselves to the Skarn hull with magnetic boots. A blindingly bright industrial cutting torch flared to life in the vacuum, throwing harsh shadows across their brutal visors. Which meant the Skarn shielding wasn't failing, it was being chewed through. Because Terran technology evolved in a brutal hypergravity crucible where delicate microcircuitry shattered under sheer atmospheric pressure, their engineering relied entirely on kinetic trauma and physical resilience, meaning their boarding strategies bypassed electronic warfare entirely in favor of simply tearing through solid titanium bulkheads by hand. The Azurian crew watched the internal sensors of the Skarn vessel via a passive data bleed. Within moments of the breach, the Skarn internal life signs began blinking out violently. The final Skarn raider panicked. It abandoned its crippled flagship and fled blindly into an adjacent asteroid field. The Iron Nomad detached and pursued. Captain Vance utilized wildly aggressive gravitational slingshots around the dense space rocks, physically battering the fleeing ship with kinetic debris until its engines critically failed, ending the threat entirely. Shortly after, a towering human engineer named Mikhail forced his way into the Luminous Path's main engine room. Lyra watched on the monitors as he approached their fused magnetic coils. He carried no delicate diagnostic pads or quantum calibrators. He carried only a heavy steel wrench and a spool of thick, insulated wire. He didn't bother scanning the microscopic fault lines. He raised the heavy wrench and struck the primary housing with a terrifying, bone-rattling impact. The brutal act made Lyra flinch. But this percussive maintenance mechanically realigned the shattered interior housing, allowing him to bypass the safety limiters and instantly jumpstart the severed connections with the improvised wire. Power flooded back into the grid. Dr. Thorne stepped onto the Azurian bridge, silently placing a heavily encrypted, Terran-coded emergency beacon onto Kalen's command console. As the severely scarred Iron Nomad slipped away into the dark void, Lyra stared at the chipped mug on her dash. The black, bitter liquid inside no longer looked like a harmless curiosity. It looked exactly like the apex predators who drank it.